Now that we've seen some of the expansion of the idea of papal power, both in the creation of a papal monarchy kind of approach where the Pope has its own real estate to take care of as well as its spiritual power. Also building on that was the confrontation between Pope Gregory VII and the German Holy Roman Emperor King Henry IV, where in 1077 essentially the Roman Emperor had to knuckle under and force himself back into good communion with the Church because the Pope had excommunicated him and had set loose a huge bunch of forces against him. This idea of a powerful church aggressively expanding in the 11th century is a very powerful one, and we're going to move towards the idea of the Crusade mentality. Now, the picture we have projected up here is a stylized kind of view of a crusader. A knight who is going to bedeck himself with the needs of war, the sword, and looks like a scabbard, and all the things he needs for his military expedition. But also notice that he is cloaking himself in the Christian cross. Many representations of the Christian cross are on the front of him to show that he is on his way to crusade, that he is not just a military warrior, he's a military warrior for a religious idea and concept. And this is an idea that's growing in Europe. It's fostered by the idea that the Bishop of Rome wants to increasingly show how powerful they are and how they can accomplish things, and they can clean up the act in terms of creating a church that is of their creation with their personnel, and that this is a long-term ability of the bishops of Rome to reassert authority and make sure that the church becomes what they wish it to be. Now, the idea of the sort of Christian warrior is something that we'll deal with in starting here, and we'll carry through in some of our next videos. But what I want to introduce here is the idea. Remember a couple of slides back, we had a conversation where we showed you the Umayyad Caliphate that stretched from basically what you know as modern-day Iran all the way across North Africa into Spain. In the year 711, by the way in which the calendar the Christians use, the CE. In the year 711, large Muslim forces from the Umayyad Caliphate had invaded what you know as modern-day Portugal and Spain and had pushed back many of the local peoples there, many of them descendants of the Visigothic peoples as well as Celtic and Roman peoples who'd lived there for centuries, pushed them back into the northern fringes, into the mountains of northern Spain, and had taken over much of what you know as modern-day Portugal and Spain and created it as part of the Caliphate, part of the world of Islam. And there are still continuing Christian and Jewish communities who are going to be living in this area under Muslim rule, but it's going to be a much more religiously complex place than many places in Europe. But it's also going to set the stage for the idea of what's going to be called the Reconquista. And what we mean by that is the reconquest of what you know as modern-day Spain and Portugal, the peninsula we call Iberia. This is going to be an over 700-year process where Spanish forces, Aragonese forces, forces from other groups in northern Spain and in Aragon on the French border are going to be pushing further south after generation, trying to take back the territories that were once controlled by Christians and now are controlled by Muslims. And there's a military mentality, a constant military warfare. And it's not just military warfare in many places over resources, access to water or foodstuffs or agricultural property. It's complicated by a religious mentality that's increasingly being seen as a Christian versus Muslim fight. Essentially a crusade, a reconquest and a crusade that has religious overtones. In many ways, it'll be a very powerful message in most of the places in Europe. And we will see a continuation of warfare, stop and start, of course, but it's not going to end until 1492 when the last Muslim forces will be expelled from the southern part of Spain, which is now called Granada. And we'll get to that when we talk some more later on. What this is also doing is this is creating the idea of a militant faith. And what I mean by militant faith is the concept of a sacred violence, that there is a way to take militancy, military power and aggression, and make it to be somehow sanctified or necessary or holy within a religious context. In other words, that you could create the idea of like a military monk, or a military order who's included within the church, but its real goal is not missionary conversion activity, it's not ministering to the poor or running universities, it's to have military might to protect Christendom, the areas of Christians, or to extend and push out religious territory and have the religious words come with the military activity. In other words, religious warriors. And that's an idea that's going to be very complex. We'll see it play out first in Iberia, but this idea will be then in other places in Europe as we move forward. One of the ultimate expressions of this idea will come under Pope Urban II, and he is going to be the one who will take the idea and in 1095 call for all the people in Europe to organize an expedition, a military expedition, to go back and retake the city of Jerusalem. And the zeal behind it, the effort behind it is religiously inspired. And Urban II is going to be the one who is going to take the sort of the bull by the horns and take this idea that Christians should reconquer and control Jerusalem as the holy city because it is their duty or their obligation as Christians. Urban II is also trying to help because there's lots of violence within Europe as many smaller areas are being conquered and reconquered by competing nobles. There's lots of disputed inheritances amongst cousins and nephews, and there's a lot of military violence of Christians fighting Christians inside Europe. The Pope has at various times tried things like the peace of God and the truce of God. These are essentially religiously sanctioned rules that you should never have a battle, for example, on Sunday. In other words, the church is trying to find a way to harness the military activities of the European aristocracy. They are fighting each other for the most part in this time period. Urban, who had received a letter from the Byzantine emperor asking for his help in hiring mercenaries, reinterprets this call from the Byzantine emperor for assistance, urges people at a place called Clermont in 1095 to take up the cross, become crusaders, and march off to save the Holy Land of Jerusalem from the occupying Muslim forces. This is now, within a 50-year time period, there's a series of popes who increasingly have been working to make themselves more powerful and the church more powerful by especially arousing forces that have been there for a long time. Gregory VII had been harnessing a sort of a disgust and dislike of many of the churchmen of having to take in people appointed by outsiders. Now, within 30 years or so, now we have Urban II organizing a crusade, giving it life, giving it a destination, and then making it holy and sanctioned. And now we have this idea of sort of a sanctioned military violence using religious ideology. It's going to be tricky, and as we go into the Middle Ages, we'll see some more about this. It's a very difficult concept. Essentially, we have sanctified violence. This had not been the first time we've seen this. If you know anything about some of the early Hebrew peoples, when they entered into the territory of the land of milk and honey, the land of Goshen, it was already occupied. And as you know from the stories of David, he did have many of the people there executed as enemies. We also have the aggressive expansion of the idea of jihad within Islam. That can be interpreted, in many different ways, the jihad. And now we have a organized Christian mentality to sanction religious violence in the name of retaking Jerusalem for Christianity. This is going to be a key moment in medieval history. It's going to be a very important note for you to take a look at this chapter. Make sure you stay up on these events and take a look at the emergence of a very powerful militant papacy, especially as they direct their attention at taking the city of Jerusalem, and they do in the summer of 1099. Take a look at all that and make sure you review your questions.